Okay. Welcome to RASE Academy podcast. RASE Academy would like to welcome our new audience to the Holding Spaces. Holding Spaces, Practice to Policy is a knowledge building platform dedicated to elevating the voices of social workers, community leaders, medical professionals, and advocates who are reshaping care and justice. Grounded in the RASE, the Will framework, the podcast brings human experiences, professional practice, and systematic analysis. The RAISE, the wheel consists of an organized structure, R, reimagining, A, advocacy, S, support, and E, encourage empowerment, blended in basic practice, policy, identity, and justice. Our mission is to create an accessible, reflective, and justice-centered space where the listener can explore the realities of social work, from the emotional labors of direct practice to the structural forces that shape policy and community well-being. Through this honest dialogue, critical injury, and cultural responsive perspectives, we aim to prepare emergency and practicing social workers to navigate complex systems, challenge inequalities, and build pathways towards collective liberation. This segment explores the emotional labor, identity, ethnical tensions, and the personal transformations that shape social work through the honest conversation. It will also be a space held for guests to share the moments that challenge them, change them, and deepen their commitment to care and justice. In this space, where humanity takes center stage, highlighting resilience, vulnerability, cultural humility, and everyday decisions social workers make to honor the dignity of people and the community we serve. Behind every policy, every intervention, and every system we navigate, there's a human story. Today, we are taking a step back and a step inward to explore the human side of social work through the lens of the profession's history. Welcome to the very first episode of Holding Spaces, Practice to Policy, the real talk aspect. I'm Sean, and today we're grounding ourselves in the roots of the profession, where we've been, where we are, and where we're headed. And so to help us explore that journey, I'm joined with Dr. Dante Bryant, someone who brings both historical insight and a lived experience. Dr. Bryant, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, I want to give you some background on Dr. Bryant. Dr. Bryant research explores the intersections of identity, politics, and value formations with a particular emphasis on how these dynamics generate competing conceptions of a just society, reconfiguring institutional arrangements, producing and differentiated modes of public life, guiding behavior, and shape social, institutional, and political decisions and discourse. This interdisciplinary approach seeks to construct critical spaces where divergent ideological postures can be brought into a sustained analytical engagement to more fully integrate the legitimacy of epistemic assumptions, normative architectures, and social political implications. Prior to joining UNC Charlotte, Dr. Bryant spent more than 25 years in community service, social activism, and policy reform. During that time, he worked with healthcare, post-secondary education, social services, and criminal justice agencies nationwide to aid the identification, implementation, and promotion of a fair and more just, nonpartisan institutional practice. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's a mouthful.
Thank you.
And
It
so,
is.
and so we're going to
Excuse me.
begin with some very direct questions. We're going to start with history, and then we're going to go forward from there. And
Okay,
so
sounds great.
this segment blends the real talk, emotional depths of your historical trajectory from framework. So let's talk about it. I want to first start with the big picture. but also the human picture from the early advocacy moments and foundational practice of the early 20th century to the present. How would you characterize this profession trajectory?
I would characterize it as complicated. Like that's probably where I would start. I think social work is interesting, right? I think prior to the 20th century, you kind of had this tension between Adams and Richmond, right? Between the kind of community oriented versus the clinically oriented approach to supporting society and trying to advance it. And I think, and please forgive me, I'm not a definitively a social work historian, right? So those who are, please feel free to correct me in the comments, whatever it may be. But I think prior to the 20th century, you kind of had this relationship, this kind of tenuous relationship between the two of them, between Adams and Richmond, and how social work should best move forward. And I think then that over time evolved, right? And I think it really kind of came to a head in the early 20th century, which is where you get the Flexner critique, so to speak, right? And for those of you who don't know, Abraham Flexner was a educator, scientific educator is what he was essentially. He is the one who kind of designed our medical educational system. And he gave a speech at what we would consider today to be a social work conference at the time. And I forget what the actual name of it was, something about like compassion and care or something to that effect. But it was essentially a social work conference. And he gave a speech, and the purpose of the speech was the question he raised was, is social work a profession? That was the fundamental question.
Mhm.
And it was kind of this, his goal was to kind of do a kind of Socratic kind of audit of social work to determine whether or not social work was truly a profession. This happens in 1915, I believe it was. And his ultimate conclusion with that is that it wasn't. It wasn't a profession. And he gave five primary reasons, right? He said that they lacked specialized knowledge, formal education and training, lacked a scientific knowledge base, professional autonomy they didn't have, and they lacked a service ideal, a moral or a code of ethics, right? And based on these kind of five criteria, according to Flexner, social work was not a profession. What it was better categorized as was a kind of moral and humanitarian efforts, is what it would be best understood as.
Mhm.
And so after that, social work responded. And everything that we call social work today is rooted kind of in a response to Flexner, the pursuit of kind of becoming a professionalized, professional organization, I guess you could say. And so rather than Flexner's critique kind of undermining social work, it kind of galvanized it. And so through the early to mid 20th century, social work reorganized itself around professional model that he described essentially. And the expansion of the profession happened relatively quickly. So within about a 50-year period, you're talking about you have the Columbia School of Social Work, which I believe it was called like the New York School of Philanthropy or something like that at the
Mhm.
time. All of a sudden, they galvanized their graduate degrees. They began to develop accreditation systems, standardized curriculum, and the American Association for Schools of Social Work, I think is what it was called, that emerged. The National Association of Social Workers was founded, I think, around 55. So it's all like within a relatively a 40-year period, right? Social work responds to Flexner's critique. It's like, you know what, listen, we're going to establish ourselves as a profession. Mhm. Um, and so then soon after that, you get the professional identity, credentialing systems, ethical standards. We also started doing theoretical research in areas like casework theory, social diagnosis, social work research. And we really drew a lot from Mary Richmond, specifically her book, Social Diagnosis, which was an attempt actually to kind of formalize social work practices using systematic assessments, right? So all of this is kind of happening, and it happened very, very, very quickly. So again, it's like about a 40-year period in that early 20th century time. And so you have specialized knowledge. Social work develops social work theory and research, formalized education, MSW programs and accreditation. You have scientific-based research journals, empirical methods start to come out of social work, professional autonomy. We start having licensing and credentialing standards, service and ethics. Our code of professional ethics emerges, right? So all of these, we literally respond point by point to what Flexner's critique was. Okay, is this making sense?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And so some of the kind of long-term consequences of that is social work, because it was professionalized, was then able to be institutionalized. So
Mhm.
social work moved from voluntary reform work to an academic discipline, which was a massive, massive shift, right? Um, we clinicalized practices. We aligned in some very real ways with the welfare state. Social work becomes kind of embedded in government programs, bureaucratic and managerial systems. We have credentialing now. Professional legitimacy became tied to degrees, licensing, accreditation standards. And so, in a very real way, even though Flexner came, and to be fair, he wasn't trying to undermine social work, right? He was trying to give an honest critique. Like, if you want to be a profession, this is what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to establish these kind of parameters and practices and ways of being. Mhm. And so shifting from kind of the informally conferred to an institutionally sanctioned identity, which is essentially what happened. Because prior to that, you had the charity worker and the activist, right? That's who the social worker was. And so, and the charity worker, the activist, now those identities had their problems, but in shifting from them to, but they were identities that were rooted in the community, essentially. Okay. So, you're known as a community activist if the community that you serve identifies you as a community activist, right? Now, there might be all kinds of problems on how you choose to engage, and there might be questions about whether or not you are engaging in paternalistic behaviors. And this is some of the critiques that came out of the kind of like the charity worker and the activist, and that's fair. But your identity and the value associated with your identity was directly tied to your engagement with the community. But when social work moves away from that and they go towards becoming the social worker, they professionalize the social worker, they trade that for institutionally sanctioned identity that allowed for the tasks that were performed by the charity worker and the activist to kind of be professionalized. And so this process of professionalization aided in transforming a range of kind of spontaneous behaviors and identities into a formalized, measured standard capable of supporting regulations, degrees, certificates, degrees, accreditation standards, all of these things, right? So a corresponding effect has been in our pursuit of professionalization, we have been able to kind of carve out and curate a very unique space, um, institutionally credited space within a larger kind of social sphere. And so now I was looking at some numbers the other day. Social work counts for upwards of like, I think it's like 800,000 degree specific employment opportunities. And there's roughly 80,000 students enrolled in social work programs kind of at any given point in time across the country,
Right.
which is an insane number, right? And so we've become this kind of, we've become a major source of financial support for academic institutions. Right? Even at UNC Charlotte, our School of Social Work is one of the largest schools in the College of Health and Human Services because we draw so many students in. So as a result, social work now again accounts for a large amount of the employment opportunities and a large part of the student body. And there's a real argument to be made that to the extent in the early 20th century that social work chose kind of the Flexner path, chose to go towards professionalization versus going towards kind of community-oriented engagements, social work has benefited tremendously, right? Because now, if you go into any social domain, what you're going to see are social workers. If you're in
Yes.
healthcare,
Yes. Mhm.
criminal justice, right, education, your primary social domains, which are healthcare, criminal justice, education, employment, right? And you might want to throw housing in there, but what you'll find is you'll find social workers who are embedded in those spaces. And the argument could be made that without the professionalization, that does not happen, right? And so concurrently, because social workers are now everywhere social work is being done, right? Because we're in every social domain. The problem is that via professionalization raises the question, what exactly is the work of social work now? Does that make sense?
Mhm.
And this was a critique that was offered up as far back as Flexner's initial assessment of social work. There was a guy, I think his name was Lerner, right? He was a social worker, and he gave a response to Flexner. And his argument was this. He was like, we should not be professionalized, essentially. The work that we do, what makes it powerful and impactful is the fact that we are not a profession and we're not defined and limited by the rules of professionalization. And you saw something very similar come out of the Lancaster School in England in the 1970s. The Black radical tradition of the 1960s offered a similar type of critique. And so did Black social workers from the 60s and 70s. Now they're all looking at it, they're all critiquing this move towards professionalization from different positions, but they're all making a very similar argument. And the argument fundamentally is that if you tether yourself to state institutions. When I say state institutions, I'm talking about federal government,
Right.
local government, state level government, and all the corresponding institutions that touch it. So again, education, healthcare, criminal justice, all of these interact with the state or are tied to state regulations. And so these different groups have been from the very beginning critiquing our choice to go down the route of professionalization, despite the fact that it helped to spread the profession everywhere and to give us access into all types of resources. The
Mhm.
argument has been consistently made that in doing that, what you have done is you've traded your individual freedom as an activist for the safety and security of the institution.
That was my
But
next
in
question. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, so but by default, by doing that, you're now bound by the institution itself, right? And this has been a tension in social work that's never really been resolved. Yeah. And so for instance, although the identities of the charity worker and the activists had their flaws, they represented a way of being that was capable of existing independent of government sanctioned institutions.
Hmm.
So as such, those ways of being, identifying and acting and moving in the world allowed them to respond creatively and freely to whatever the community's needs and requests were. So if the community needed people to go over here and acquire resources, they could do that. If the community needed them to come up with food banks, they could do that. They
Right.
could
Right.
respond creatively and actively because there was nothing constraining them, right? They could freely choose how they moved about and how they responded to the needs of the community. In contrast, the institutionally established social worker is tethered to the state and they're tethered to the state sanctioning body. And so as a result, their identity, their value, their modes of engagement are perpetually mediated by the social and political institutions they're embedded in.
Hmm.
So if the institution says you cannot do X, Y, and Z, the tethered social worker cannot do X, Y, and Z. Right? Um, Orlando Patterson has this great quote. He says that a person can only be truly be in service to that which empowers them. So whatever the thing is that gives you your legitimacy, that gives you your power and gives you your authority,
Hmm.
that is the only thing that you can truly serve. Can't serve anything else. And if you act in a way that contradicts or is in conflict with the thing that empowers you, what you are subject to is your power being stripped from you. And we saw this, right, with the 2025 bans on DEI within social work, right? Social work was really confronted with I think the extent of its embeddedness because we didn't really know how to respond. Yeah, if you look at CSWE and the National Association of Social Workers, neither one of them was capable of coming up with a pragmatic, comprehensive, and definitive response to how social workers should respond to the DEI bans. Despite us having a code of
Right.
ethics, right, which then informs a set of moral principles, despite that existing, they still were not able to come up with a comprehensive response. And so you kind of saw this bifurcation within the social work profession, where the social profession began to divide itself. You had those in one camp who were arguing, listen, they're telling us that we can't do these things, and we are institutionally embedded. We're dependent upon these institutions.
Mhm.
Because we're dependent upon them, the best thing for us to do is to kind of strategically acquiesce where we can, right? Uh, uh, and so if they want us to take the language down, we'll take the language down, but we'll keep the practice in the background,
Right,
right?
right.
If they want us to change it, if they want us to change the
Mhm.
title, we'll remove the web page, but we'll put a link for us to go somewhere else. So it's like this kind of like strategic resignation. And then you had the other side, right, who were kind of more in the abolitionist camp. Okay.
Right.
And they're more so like, no, we need to fight this tooth and nail at every turn, at every benchmark, and make sure that we make it clear that we are ethically and morally against what the institution is now promoting.
Mm.
Okay. And both of these have their problems, right?
Right,
Both of these
right.
have the problem. And really what you're seeing is again that same tension from the very foundations resurfacing
Mhm.
again in a different way. Because the question then becomes, are we in service or in pursuit of professionalization? And are we in service to the institution or are we in service to the community? And I think that's
Right,
a tension within social work that we've never truly resolved, right? And it's
right.
reemerging. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now. And so, oddly enough, Flexner comes along in the early stages and says, this is the route that you should take. And we take it.
Mhm.
And even though he offers that route, there's others who are arguing, no, we should focus our attention, our efforts, and our energy on engaging with the community and not worry about professionalization because that will limit our capacities. Right. And now here we are in 2026. And in
Mhm.
just a year ago, again, DEI bans, all of a sudden, something that's written into our EPAS standards, that's directly implied in our code of ethics that was restructured, right? Because not only, it's interesting, I was looking at our code of ethics the other day, and the changes that we made into our code of ethics, I think it was in 2020, I think the changes were made to the code of ethics, I think it was, to particularly 1.05. Right? It's relatively subtle, but we go from cultural competence, right, to cultural activism. Because what's added in there is this obligation to actively engage social institutions that we feel are racially, economically, whatever,
Mhm.
oppressive in some type of way. And so social work makes a very clear shift towards activism. So now it's embedded in our ethical requirements. It was always kind of implied, but now it becomes definitively stated. We are required to act on the institutions that we deem socially disadvantageous, right? But the
Mhm.
problem is that as embedded social workers, we are tethered to those institutions. Those institutions are the ones that give us our credibility. So, to what extent can you push back against the institution that employs you before that
Right.
institution? You see what I'm saying? And this is
Mhm.
the dilemma between these two groups.
Mhm.
You have the abolitionists saying that we should push back because it's written into our code of ethics, and they're correct. The problem is does someone allow, how long does the person who feeds you allow you to bite them before they stop feeding you?
You're right, right. But what I'm
On the
seeing is
oh,
what
go ahead. I'm sorry.
what I've been seeing is some professionals have left the institution and have formulated their own
Hmm.
community directed um, forum,
Yeah.
or they stay within the institution and then on the side they have their own. where they can actually work with the community.
Yeah, so those are it's interesting. I think that those are two models that social work hasn't really spent much time with, right? And so one of them is when we talk about empowerment, if you notice in social work, and look at particularly social work education, we made a very definitive shift towards social constructionism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Begin to draw that from sociology, and we started pulling people like Berger and Luckman, and even Marxism, to be honest with you, right? On this idea of like the if we construct society the right way, then we can eliminate things such as racism and poverty, and so forth, and so on. So it became very focused on institutional reform, right? Which was throughout your social when you were doing your degree in social work, that was kind of the focus,
Right.
institutional reform. The only problem with that, I say the only problem, one of the problems with that approach is that it actually disempowers the communities who are supposedly negatively affected by those institutions. And the reason why I say that, and that argument is being made, is because if the institution is the sole proprietor and sole cause of the problem, then the only solution has to come from the institution itself. Right? And what is neglected is community capacity building, where social work turns its attention towards the community and helps the community to develop the capacity to produce the things that it needs so that it no longer has to interact with that institution. And that's a very
Yeah.
different approach,
Yes.
right? That is the approach that the Black Panther Party took, Black Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when you're talking about it was fundamentally, and even like the foundations of the United States, to be honest with you, right? Like any group that has wanted to position itself as independent and free had to do two fundamental things. One, it had to develop the capacity to be able to produce the things that it needed. That's number one.
Mm-hmm.
And then two, it had to develop the capacity to protect the things that it produced. And once you've done that, now you have the leverage because you're no longer tethered to the institution. I'm no longer dependent on you for food. I'm no longer dependent upon you for education. I can stand independently of you. And so now we can come to the table as equals. But if we say that the institutional reform is the only way to get to a more just society, then those who are negatively impacted by those institutions cannot come to the table as equals because they're not. They're dependents by default, right? And so, like you said, but some of those people that you're seeing, what you're seeing is a abandonment of the institution to go and engage in capacity building. And then you have those others who I think Hardy and Moten refer to them as the kind of subversive intellectuals.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones who
Mm-hmm.
stay within the institutions, right, and use the resources of the institutions to then do the work they want to do on the outside, right? There's this great quote in this book called The Undercommons. Hardy and Moten say that I come to you under false pretenses with bad documents out of love. And he's talking about academics who are activists coming into the academy. He
Mm-hmm.
says, I come to give you what you don't need. Now I come to give you what you need but don't want. And I come to steal from you what you've already stolen from me so I can give it to others, right? I just butchered that quote, but it's essentially in that vein. And the idea is that social workers, as they're currently positioned, are going to have to choose to betray either the communities that they've committed themselves to or the institutions in which they're embedded. Right? But betrayal doesn't necessarily mean abandonment
Right.
because
Okay.
you can stay. So that second group you mentioned about those who are staying within the institution, they've
Mm-hmm.
betrayed the institution and they've betrayed their own professionalization. But they're
Yeah.
remaining embedded within the institution.
That's
And
right.
you know what I mean? And they call this kind of the undercommons is what this is known
Mm-hmm.
as. It is the unarticulated, unidentifiable spaces within institutions where people hide and steal stuff and then take it out into the community,
Take it
right?
up.
Like that's take it out to the community. And that's an option for the embedded social worker, right?
Right.
Because one of the things that the embedded social worker is spot on accurate about is that as embedded, I have access to resources that I do not have
Right.
access to otherwise. And
Right.
it doesn't make sense for me to abandon all of these resources because I can use these resources to help the community. Now, can I help the community comprehensively how I want to? No, because I'm embedded
You
and I'm,
still.
I'm limited to the rules and regulations of this
Mhm.
institution. But at least I can help and I have resources that I would not have otherwise to be able to do that, you know? And then you have the one who's in the community and they're like, you know what? I want to be able to move and help freely as I see fit. I don't want the limitations of the institution, right? And there is this debate back and forth between which one of them is right, right?
Right.
Um, I think there's an argument to be made that both are necessary. I
Whatever
really
works
do.
for you,
Well, yeah, I think part
pretty
of it
much.
is to, yeah, I always talk with people, particularly about activism. I'm like, you have to really determine what your temperament is,
Hmm.
right? There are people who, because of their temperament, having to negotiate what they want in terms of give and take with an institution is not suitable for them. They don't work well in that environment, right? They want to be able to freely choose and respond to the community based on what the community communicates that it needs, right? And that's fair. But then there's others who have a different temperament, who are better suited to negotiate expressed activities for access to resources, right? And these two people, I think, when they work together, are much more powerful than are when they're separated. Now, the problem is if you have a community-based temperament, you don't need to be in an institution,
No,
right?
not
You
gonna
just
work.
don't. Right? It's not going to work. And
Yeah.
if you have the temperament for an institution, you may not be the best candidate for the community engagement,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
But the dialect between the two of them, if you keep them in conversation with one another, then you
It's
have something
workable.
that's much
Yeah.
more powerful. Exactly. Right. Because I ask you, like, um, yeah, it becomes much more dynamic. And I think then there's a third, which is the subversive intellectual who kind of straddles the fence between both.
Between
Right.
two.
But to your question about like the state of social work in the 20th century, like right now we're gonna have to decide which way we're gonna go, right? We're gonna have to really figure out collectively what is the best pathway forward for this profession and essentially what type of game are we willing to play? And while there's an infinite number of games that we could choose from, whatever game we choose as a profession has to be one that's replicable over time, that invites other people to want to play with us, right?
Hmm.
That includes the community and institutions, depending on what that dynamic looks like and which we give more, which one we give more weight to, right? Um, but it has to encourage other people to want to continue to play with us. And we have to be able to repeat this game over time in order to have sustainability. And
Okay.
so once you just have those two parameters alone, the options that are available to how social work will move forward get narrowed down significantly. And I don't know that we're having real conversations about what that's going to look like. And that's unfortunate because we're going to have to, social work is going to have to, I would argue, define and slash redefine itself in a way that's sustainable
Hmm.
um, and productive. The problem is social work first has to define what is it that it's actually trying to produce.
Right. Right.
And right now, that's not, I would argue that that's not clear. Yeah.
'Cause right now, what I'm seeing is we're just putting out fires. We put out fires, but we don't really come to resolute solutions.
No. Well, I mean, that assumes a couple things, right?
Mhm.
I would say the first part is just putting out fires, is that if you are institutionally embedded, which we are, then you are governed by the institution. Your behaviors and actions are governed by the institution. So what is fundable is defined by the institution. So
Okay.
even if you develop a community-based program, the government has to decide, or whoever's funding you has to decide what is actually fundable. And so if you come up with something that is outside the the realm of what has been identified as fundable, it becomes unfundable. Okay. So
Mhm.
so there's parameters there. But this is the thing, right? Is that oftentimes the solution or the best response, well, I won't even say solutions, the best response to social problems oftentimes are radical responses to social problems.
Mhm.
Problem with radical responses to social problems is radical behavior is not intelligible to institutions.
Right.
They can't make sense of it. It's something that's beyond their comprehension as a structured, organized institution. So even if you come up with a profoundly effective and radical response to a social problem, in order for you to get the support as an institutionally embedded social work, in order for you to get the support and backing of your institution, you're going to have to translate the radical into the normative. Does that make sense?
You're right.
Like,
So it doesn't look like it's a threat.
so it doesn't look like it's a threat. But the moment you translate from the
Mhm.
radical into the normative, it no longer has the radical impact that it once had. By definition,
Yeah.
it loses its impact, right? And
Okay.
so anything that you bring into an institution, and this is one of the critiques that the abolitionists tend to put out there, and I think, and they may be right about this, right?
Mhm.
Any kind of reform efforts that you bring into an institution will eventually be absorbed by that institution. Because before
Mhm.
they can come in the door, they first have to be dressed the right way. They have to speak the right way. They
Mhm.
have to adhere to our standards, our rules, our codes of conduct. They have to do all of these things to get in the door before they can become part of the institution. By the time they've gone through that process, they're no longer what they were before. They've become part of the institution, right? And if you think of institutions as living entities,
Mhm.
I think it's a decent way to think about it.
Mhm.
No entity is going to continue to consume something that's killing it. You're
Right.
only going to consume things that contribute to the preservation of your life. So if someone offers you something that is potentially poisonous, before you will consume it on any type of regulatory basis, you're going to have to figure out how to make this thing less poisonous, which means it has to be converted into something else.
Something else. Right.
And once it's converted to something else, it's no longer what it once was, and it no longer has the impact that it once had. So, which is why one of the critiques of institutionalized DEI, which is why that critique, one of those critiques is that DEI was never designed to be an independent entity. It was always dependent upon institutions accepting it as an appropriate way of practice.
Mhm.
But the institution's not going to accept something as an appropriate way of practice that fundamentally undermines the existing structure of the institution itself. So I'm only going to accept it I'm only going to bring it into my institution if it serves the existing if it serves moving me towards the existing goals of the institution and is compatible with the existing fundamental structure of the institution. If it's not compatible with the existing fundamental structure, then I'm not going to accept it, right? And so one of the critiques of DEI as an institutional mechanism was that it was always a supplement to existing institutions. And as a supplement, it'll never change the fundamental structure. It's an accessory, becomes an accessory, right? That ultimately serves the initial premises and purposes of the institution itself. It becomes domesticated in a sense, right? Um, you think about like my wife and I have a dog, right? And when I was talking to my kids, one of my daughter was like, where do dogs come from? I'm like, dogs are essentially domesticated wolves. And she was like, really? And I was like, yes, but you can't bring a wolf into your house. Can't do it because it would cause complete chaos. But if you want that in your home, you have to go through the process of translating the wolf into something that's legible. You see what
Mhm.
I'm saying? That's
Mhm.
non-threatening. And then once that is, now it can be brought into the home as something that is loved, adored, that contributes to the household. You know what I mean? Like you can do that
Mm-hmm.
once it's been translated. And so that's this is the dilemma that social work is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're gonna have to betray something at some point, right? Like whether it's our loyalties to professionalization or it's our loyalties to the community. One of those is gonna have to be betrayed. But again, betrayal doesn't mean abandonment because we could very easily choose to remain to prioritize professionalization and abandon and betray our commitments to the community, but still remain in the community itself. And there's a whole branch of social workers. I would imagine your when I say social workers, I'm talking about mainstream social work,
Mm-hmm.
right? So Mary Richmond, Jane Addams, that branch. And I would imagine your colleagues or peers who have left the institutions and went back into the communities to, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of part of this discourse of um, we'd rather betray the institution or professionalization and stay in the communities. But there are also those, again, that you can very easily have your loyalties and prioritize the institution itself and your professionalization and remain in the communities. And again, those who are in the communities, i.e., your friends who have left the institutions, would argue that is what social work has been doing for the last 20, 30, 40 years, that
Right.
it has aligned itself with the institutions. And as a byproduct, it has become part of the managerial class. It's become part of the quote unquote the bureaucracy, so to speak, right? Because it's comfortable. It has all the resources. It has the grants. It has the funding. It has, you know what I mean? The
Yeah.
institutional support, the institutional backing. It has the licensing. I can get a degree. I can become a licensed clinical social worker, mhm, without ever having to get confirmation from the community that I'm about to serve, which is a crazy proposition if your priority is community engagement,
Mm-hmm.
right? How is it that you can get, you know what I mean? You can acquire the
Mm-hmm.
status,
Yeah.
the legal, financial, right? Social capital and status of a social worker without ever having the community have to sign off on it.
Right.
And if that's the case, and again, it just depends on what your priorities are. And I'm not knocking any particular set of priorities. You know, it is what it is. Social work is going to do whatever it does, but I think these are conversations that we at least need to have,
Right.
right? And at the very least, we need to be honest about what it is that we're doing and why we're choosing to do it, whether it's aligning ourselves fundamentally with the institution or aligning ourselves with the community, because each one of those is going to take a set of strategic practices and behaviors to
Mm-hmm.
engage in to ensure its longevity, regardless of which door you walk through. That makes sense.
Okay. Well,
I
this
can
is a
rant,
good.
I can ramble about this
I
forever. You
know
know
this is a
this.
good conversation. We may have to revisit some of this stuff, but okay. So I want to go on to the next questions for time's sake. So my next question has to do with growth, stagnation, and regression. When
Yeah.
you look at the profession today, do you feel that social work has expanded in impact or effectiveness as the factors of stagnation or regression that challenges impact?
Well, I would say I would probably refer back to what we were just talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
That tension, that kind of tension between
Yeah.
the professional expertise and reformist ideals, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and it really how you view the progress of social work really depends on where you're standing when you make that decision. If you want to look at the proliferation and growth of the profession, then our participation in the Flexner model
Mm-hmm.
and the professionalization of workers is undoubtedly beneficial because literally, I mean, there are few degrees that you can go. There are a few degree programs that are faster growing than social work on college campuses across the country. We're producing more
Right.
professionals on an annual basis than
Mm-hmm.
any just than most disciplines outside of like your STEM and IT areas, right?
Right.
We've surpassed social sciences, we've surpassed the humanities. Like, we're at second or third place, STEM fields, education, and then social work. And we're right in that domain. And so the sheer volume of is a testament to the potentially the positive impacts of professionalization. And so and if you're in that camp, then yes, we're doing a great job, right? And it's not to say that those embedded social workers or the professionalization of social work has not made positive impacts in communities. We've saved lives, right? We've helped families, we've protected children, we've done all of those things. Um, but on the flip side, the question is, have we actually moved closer to empowering individuals, communities, and populations to
Right.
be able to ensure the continued reduction of the negative impacts of social disadvantagement?
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't know that we've done that
Mm-hmm.
because we haven't really done much with capacity building over the last 40 years, 50 years,
Or
right?
touch the
Oh,
surface.
exactly. So those are different, but those are different types of questions, right? Um, I was talking to some students a while ago. I said, if we are fundamentally as a profession big on empowerment within a capitalist framework, one of the biggest things that you can do for empowerment is economic advancement, helping communities figure out how to economically flourish by using the resources they have immediately available to them.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, as a social worker, you'll never be required to take an economics class. You'll learn nothing about money, how to start small businesses, right? Like you're not going to learn any about this in social
You're
work.
so
But
right. I didn't even
you
think
know,
about that. You're
you'll never
right.
take a class on that. But there's nothing, but the thing is, you also, as an individual, as a community, as a population, you can, whatever leverage you have is fundamentally predicated on to what degree can you produce what you need, independent of others, and
Mm-hmm.
protect it. Like that's what it comes down to.
Right.
And so
Right.
if you don't develop the capacity to do those things, then the amount of leverage that you have is diminished more and more. If I am dependent upon you for the production of the things that I need, then by default, I am not only tethered to you, I am dependent
Good
upon you.
on you. Yeah. Right.
And so when you say jump, I better say how high, right?
Mm-hmm.
Conversely, if I can produce my own resources, but I cannot protect them, then they're not mine.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Because you can come
Right.
along and take them anytime you see fit, and I
Mm-hmm.
have no rebuttal, right? And so you need both, but we don't teach social workers how to do that within communities. We don't teach them those skills. And so when you're talking about the impacts and growth of the profession, it's like, yes, we have grown and we've had an impact, right?
Mm-hmm.
And arguably a very positive one. But if you're asking about how we altered the structure of the structure of society in a way that allows for various populations to come to the table with some type of leverage so they can then um, negotiate for themselves. Well, I can't say that we've done that, right? And
Right.
that was and that was a critique that the what later became the National Association of Black Social Workers. That was one
Mm-hmm.
of their critiques against social work at the time, right? Was that because of the way that they've chosen to engage in professionalization, that they were abandoning the idea of empowering communities to be able to negotiate and leverage for themselves.
For themselves. Yeah.
They were creating dependency rather than independence, so to speak. And so it just really depends on like you know, where you're standing when that question's asked as it relates to what
Mm-hmm.
your response is. That's probably what I would say. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Good. Great. 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 Great conversations. I think we need to do a transcript of this podcast just for reflection purposes. Um, okay, and this is my my final question to you. We're going to discuss human experience beyond the systems. So let's bring this into a lived experience of practice. When you think about the human side of social work, the emotional labor, the identity work, the relational complexity, how do you see that intersecting with professions historical trajectory from all that we talked about today for now. So it's we've talked about from the institutional part. We
Yeah.
talked about the grassroots part. But for someone who's in the field, who's working, you know, and this is the person I'm thinking in my head is the person who has that integrity, who wants to, do something more for his community in a social workspace. What would you say to that?
I would say that they need to figure out what, kind of like we touched on earlier, they need to figure out what their temperament is, what they can live with.
Okay.
Um, if you are at your core a community activist in the sense that you want you need, not want, but you need the and flexibility to respond to whatever community or population you're serving
Mm-hmm.
with relative freedom and you only want to be accountable to the community that you're serving, then your best bet is going to be to build something within that community, within that community. That's going to be your best bet, right? You would really struggle if you try to work with even a local organization that partners with that community, right?
Right.
You're going to have to be someone that builds something with under the guidance of, right, and in service to the community itself. Right? Um, and so, but on the flip side, right, if you're someone who would prefer a certain level of stability, right? Because that first person, that's going to come. There's all types of you're gonna have to live with all types of gray areas, right? Um, you may not necessarily have the financial support that you need. You may not necessarily have the job security that you need. You may not necessarily, you don't necessarily have that the resources that you need, right? So there's a
Right.
lot that goes into that. There's a lot that goes in, and there are people who are best suited for that space. And if that's you,
Mhm.
then that's where you need to because if that's you and you try to come into the local caring institution, whatever it is, right, you're going to have a really difficult time, a
Mhm.
very difficult time. And that struggle that you're having is going to be an internal struggle because there's going to be conflict between what you believe is the right thing for you to be doing
Right.
and the means
Right.
by which you're able to do that, right? On the flip side, if you're someone and I've been that person, I've been that person, right? And at that time, I worked strictly in communities. I have transitioned and moved, and I've gone all the way up into the political domain, right,
Mhm.
where there's very little autonomy, all the way back down to communities to back. I've moved back and
Right.
forth depending on where I was temperamentally, what I was trying to accomplish, right? Because I think those different domains, the local organization, the tetherment to the institution, those are three different domains that offer three different types of supports and resources and they offer three different types of strengths and weaknesses, right? And conversely, three different types of strengths and freedoms. Yeah. So you have to figure out at any given point in your journey where you are best, what your temperament best aligns you with. And I think, that's a constant assessment that needs to happen because rarely is someone stay in one domain the entirety of their life. Some people do, but you may not, right?
Mhm.
Um, Depending on how your life shifts and fluctuates over time, right?
Right.
You might
Right.
need more security. You might need the security of the institution because you have a mortgage, you have kids, if you
Mhm.
whatever it may be, right? Or you might, or you may not need that, and you can be in the community. So I think being aware of yourself and to can help you to figure out where best to place yourself. Number two, I would say that you also have to be able to understand how all three of these domains can contribute to the same goal, but in different ways.
Right.
And
Okay.
if you're able to
Okay.
maintain that clarity, you can then move through these different institutional domains and social domains and still be contributing to the same goal, just from different vantage points. But that requires a great deal of personal commitment and inner discipline, right? Because the moment you step into the institution, it becomes very easy to be washed away or by the
Mhm.
institutional norms itself. So that would be my
Okay.
response to that. Yeah.
All right. Good nuggets, good nuggets. So, as I'm thinking about everything that was said, what I see that this is just a reminder that professions they evolve, and that is not just a structural thing within a person, but it's very deeply personal. Wherever
Yeah.
you are personal on your journey as a social worker, practitioner, or whatever you decide to call yourself, it's a personal thing first, and then it's a structural position that you find yourself trying to take. And so, based on the current trends, what factors do you feel would influence or challenge future direction of the field? Within the code of ethics, context and education, community, relative to diversity, equity, and inclusion brands that shape policy and institutional decision making going forward.
I think we're seeing it right now, right? I think the federal DEI bans is uh, a very significant pivoting point or opportunity. I'll say opportunity, an opportunity for social work, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I don't know that we're making the best use of this opportunity, right? I think generally speaking, the response has been to either, like we said before, either figure out a way to keep structure,
Mhm.
leave the current structure and do what we were doing when we had institutional support for it, right? When the government was actually backing DEI.
Right, right.
I think what we haven't done as effectively and openly is ask whether or not what we were doing was the right thing for us to be doing in the first place, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I think now is an opportunity for us to do that, to not just double down on what we've always done or abandon the institution so that we can double down on what we've always done. But I think now is a legitimate time for us to stop for a minute. Okay, listen, is what we've been doing really the best thing for us to be doing? Right.
Right.
Um, and so in a very real sense, I think we're kind of like we're back at like the kind of the Abraham Flexner impasse, right?
Mhm.
Where
Mhm.
Flexner's like, this is the direction that you should go, right? And Latzer, his counterpart, was like, no, no, this is the direction that we should go. Right. And so we're kind of back at that impasse all over again. And well, I think we have the opportunity to choose not only which direction we're going to go, but what that direction is going to look like for us. I don't know that we're taking the full opportunity to do that.
Mhm.
And part of that might just be because we're maybe in survival mode right now. I don't know.
Right,
But
right.
I do think that it is an opportunity and it's a pivotal one. It's absolutely pivotal. I think what social work chooses to do over the next 5 or so years is going to shape the profession for the next 15, 20, 50 years down the line. I really do. Yeah.
Okay, so my last question, you've already answered of the
Yeah.
roles of emerging social workers towards the future. So I'm just going to end with that. Dr. Bryan, I just thank you for your honesty and your insight.
Yeah.
What would you share today that reminds us that social work is not just a profession, but that it's a living, breathing community shaped by people who practice it? What would be some ending words that you would like to give forward?
Um, I don't know. It's a great question, actually. You know, it's a great question. Um, I would say that probably the most important thing to me as a social worker is clearly defining who you are going to serve,
Right.
um, and then how you intend to do so. That's which, I think sounds relatively simple, but when you start thinking through that, I think it becomes it's quite a task, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and being able to and then the dexterity or integrity to carry that out, regardless of
Mm-hmm.
what it might look like, is a whole
Mm-hmm.
another animal in and of itself. But I would say, yeah, I think try to clarify for yourself who and or what is it that you want to be in service to. I think people is just a bad definition, right? It's entirely too broad. So you need to be in
Absolutely.
service. right? There needs to
Yeah.
be something that, and I think once you clarify what it is that you're committing your life to, or at least this portion of your life, let's say,
Mhm.
uh, it clarifies a series of decisions that you will be making down the road, right? Because it narrows down your options for you in terms of how best to behave and how to engage and how to respond and what to push back against, what not to push back against, when to put
Right.
your head down. You know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
once you've clarified who it is you are going to truly be in service to. Right? And so I think that's probably the biggest thing. Figure that out
Okay.
and how you want to serve them. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And so for our listeners, I want to leave you with this. The trajectory of social work isn't fixed. It's shaped by our choices, our advocacy, our willingness to challenge systems, and our commitment to justice. We inherit a legacy, but we also have the power to transform it. So this is a call to action. If today's conversation resonates with you, share this episode with your colleague or your classmate. And if you have your own reflections on the profession's trajectory, I'd love to hear that from you. Thank you for joining RASE and me for the episode 1 of Holding Spaces. Practice the policy. Next time, we'll continue to explore how history, humility, and policy interests intersects in the work we do every day. Until then, take care of yourself and take care of each other.